Welcome, everyone. Thank you for having me again. This is possibly the most indulgent talk I've ever given. And it made me, I was just in the bathroom thinking, wow, how privileged am I that I can afford to splash out money on a pretty nice drum kit when I don't know how to drum. And most people, you get a beginner kit and think, right, well, I'll upgrade when I think I need to. It's like, no, this is going to be fun. I will splash out. In fact, I splashed out twice. Do I want to go into this? Yeah, so it does become relevant. So I'd like to start by blaming my friend Alice for all of this, basically. Alice is a friend of mine at church, and she plays the drums for us in what's lovingly known as the junior church band, but almost none of us were teachers or whatever in the junior church, rather than kids in junior church. So she was playing her TD-11, another Roland drum kit, and I said, oh, that looks fun. I wonder whether I should get a drum kit. And she'd say, yeah. So suitably encouraged, we went along to Dawson's, which I have to say they've been incredibly useful. I don't normally do sort of advertising, but they were great. And we were looking at drum kits, and there was the TD1 DMK, which is more of an entry level, sort of nice, but entry level. And they had the TD17 KV. This is a picture of the TD17 KVX, which is sort of another couple £100 or so. And I thought, I really don't need to go for the highest end. So I'll just go for the TD17 KV, and I bought that. And I'll come back later on to exactly why I chose that one. And then I started thinking, and this was partly, my wife Holly really likes the fact that I'm learning to play the drums, because it means that she can give me things for birthday and Christmas presents, and apparently I'm normally quite hard to buy for. So she's buying me a drum monitor for Christmas, and then I think next birthday will be a new pedal, and next Christmas will probably be a new drum throne. Why it's called a drum throne rather than a stool, I don't know. Is it sort of drummers need to feel a bit more important, so they have a throne? It's a stool, for goodness sake. Anyway, so she was encouraging me on this, and so I started thinking, well, what could I do in terms of upgrades? So you can see here, this has a rather nice, this is a hi-hat, a regular hi-hat stand with an electric hi-hat on the top that does actually go up and down. Whereas on the TD17 KV, it's an electronic pedal and a bit that's effectively just one of the cymbals. And it has one crash cymbal and one ride cymbal, and they're both sort of half rubber, half plastic, and not brilliant. This has two crash cymbals, the sort of top left, the uppermost one and the rightmost one, and then a really nice ride cymbal that's got 3 triggers. All of this stuff may make no sense to you at all whatsoever, and that's fine. But it's nice, okay? This is the nicer version. And I started thinking, oh, well, I could ask Holly for the nice ride cymbal, and then maybe I could ask for the nice hi-hat. And I was thinking, by the time I've actually bought all the upgrades, I might as well have just bought the nicer kit. So I thought, well, if I buy the really nice kit, and then I give my TD17 to Alice, and then Alice can put her TD11 in church permanently, and then we can move the previous Yamaha DTX 400 that was in church into the halls as a practice kit, then everything's quite efficient, and I end up with the drum kit that I really want. So to go back to my sort of introductory sentence, it's a real position of privilege to be able to do that. And my guess is that most of us here are in positions of privilege. Maybe not quite as much as me, in that I get to splash out that money, and then I have the drum kit in my shed, which is my home office, so I can do a bit of work, do a bit of drumming, do a bit of work on the V-Drum Explorer, which is what tonight's really about, and have lots of fun. So I've got enough time to do that. And then I get to come and talk to you good folks about it, and then do the same in NDC London. And then at some point I will probably do, if that's not sort of meta already, a meta talk about making the most out of your hobbies and side hustles. So I try to get as much as I can out of any one hobby. But it really is a privilege to be able to do so, and I want us all to sort of just be grateful for the privileges that we have. So that's sort of the background as to how I got into the drumming at all. I said I would come back to why I chose this kit. And it's really all about this. I'll lift up. There we go. Yep. So that is the TD17. Just the TD17, which is the module or brain, as it's known, of the kit. It's the bit where all the electronics happens. So the difference between the KV and the KVX is in terms of all the pads, the things you hit, cymbals and things, but the module is exactly the same. There is another kit that's more expensive called the TD50, which is about £7,000, and I'm not quite that privileged. It's possible that I may have looked for some used ones on eBay, but yeah, I'm not going there really. But when we saw the TD17, I sort of saw it looks a nicer module than the TD1 DMK was sort of, well, a few knobs and buttons, and it looked like it had a sort of two-line display, and it clearly wasn't really going to be as smart a brain as this. And I thought, I wonder what the connectivity is going to be like with a computer. And the chap in the shop isn't going to know this. And that's absolutely fair enough. And I may be the only person that he'll ever encounter in his life who cares about this. But I was thinking, wouldn't it be nice? We've got, you can see on here, there's a little screen there. It's not a bad display, but it's still the size of 3 postage stamps put together. And the user interface, for what it is, the user interface is really, really well designed. But given how much you can do with the kit, it feels like I want a better better environment for editing it, which is where I went. Now, to be clear, I have spent probably 10 times as much time writing code for the drums as I have drumming. So yeah, I'll reflect later on about pros and cons of this. But I have spent far more time, any time I end up saving in terms of time spent editing configurations on the computer rather than on the module, I have wasted hundreds of times over by writing the code. But it is huge amounts of fun. So the basic idea is that this one module has 100 kits on. So it's currently set to acoustic all wood, which is kit 1. Kit 2 is fat rock power toms, etc. I will play you later on the bottle phaser kit because it's great and very, very silly. But there are 100 kits, 50 preset ones that you can still edit, and 50 that are sort of, well, we couldn't be bothered to come up with another 50. Have at it. Do whatever you want, and you can assign to each instrument. There are 2 meanings of instrument. It's unfortunately overloaded. To each trigger, let's say. So a trigger is one of the actual inputs on the drum kit. So that would be sort of the head of a snare drum or the rim of a snare drum. Likewise for the toms, the edge or the bow of the crash cymbals, or the edge bow or edge bow or bell of the ride cymbal, and then you've got the hi-hat, which has head and rim as well. And then there's the kick that's just a single trigger. So for each of those triggers, you can assign one of the 200 or so instruments. So just because it's a kick drum doesn't mean it has to have a kick drum. You can make it so that when you press down on the kick pedal, you get a gong or whatever it is. And not only, you don't just say, well, I want it to be the gong. You say, I want it to be the gong, and I want to change the size of it from 20 inches to 22 inches or whatever. And I want to apply some muffling. And we'll apply reverb and make it sound like we're in a big concert hall, and just loads and loads of options, huge amounts of options. So I wanted to know how to do that from a computer. And I started off initially failing to find any documentation. And in fact, I asked on a V-drum. These are called V-drums, by the way. The Roland electronic drum kit branding is V-drum. I asked on one of the forums, and someone said, oh, no, don't know whether there's any way of doing this. I thought, OK, well, I'll start off. There's an SD card slot in there, and you can copy the kits So I started off by painstakingly copy the kit, look on the computer, look at the files on the computer, right, make one small change on the module, and then copy the file again, diff the files, and then I could sort of gradually pinpoint out of these thousands and thousands of fields what meant what. Fortunately, I then found on only the US Roland site, not the UK Roland site, I found the documentation. I shall show you this. So this is, half of this is the TD17. There we go. This is the TD17 MIDI implementation documentation, and most of it is just tables, which will make more sense when I explain. But it's really not bad. It kind of assumes you know some things, but it's saying, well, you can, it can receive data from channel voice messages, so note on, polyphonic key pressure, control change, program change, etc. And those are sort of just standard MIDI things. So the MIDI comes through the USB, although it also has has MIDI over Bluetooth, which I will come on to later as a future potential thing. So it's got normal MIDI things, but also there's what's called sysx in MIDI, which I had no idea about any of this before starting. And sysx are system exclusive messages, which is basically vendor specific. You can send a bit of information, and these are all, well, they're normally fairly small chunks. For some of these messages, I do send sort of about, yeah, a few hundred bytes, but it's not designed for streams or anything like that. There's also separately over the USB, it comes as an audio input and an audio output. So you can play music from your laptop into the drum module, so that if you've got the headphones on, you can be listening to that and drum away at it. And likewise, you can record from the drum module to the computer, and I'll demonstrate that a bit later and explain how it was important for some of the code. So these system exclusive messages, the important bit is that the TD17 and TD50, and as far as I can tell, those are the only drum kits that support this, Roland has given a specific bit of protocol that says, if you send this message, you say, I would like the data within the module at this address to be this segment of data. And MIDI is not inherently bidirectional, so you have to open one MIDI channel out and one MIDI channel in. And you send out something saying, I would like to see I would like the 100 bytes at, OX003 or whatever it is. And then you receive it asynchronously, and some of the interesting bit was, what does this look like as an interface when you've only got unidirectional streams? And fortunately, let's start showing you some code. In my MIDI project here, I have the sysx client, which is increasingly inaccurately named, given that it's got non-sysx stuff. We basically, whenever I'm connected and have the device open, I'm always listening for sysx messages. And when I request some data, I say, OK, well, I will add it to the list of things I am expecting and send the request out. And whenever I get some data back, I will see whether I was expecting it. And if so, I will set the task continuation source that's responsible for this byte array, and then magically the consumer will get to see it. You don't only get data when that happens, because if I start changing the assignments on here, depending on other settings, you can say, send the edits back over MIDI or not. But it will send, hey, I've just set the data to be this. I've just set the data to be that. So in theory, and I haven't implemented this, within my control of the program I'll show you in a minute, I could react to whatever I'm doing on the module and adjust the UI at the same time. So we have a way of requesting data, we have a way of sending data, we have no way of knowing whether the data that we've sent has been received or not. just because that's not part of the protocol. I could then request it and check that it does actually match what I've sent, but I haven't bothered doing that. It's been pretty reliable. I mean, it's connected via a cable. It's not too bad. There are some aspects that aren't terribly reliable. If you know what you're requesting, so far I don't remember seeing any aspects where I said, I would like the 12 bytes at this particular address because I know they're important, and then not seen them come back. What I have done is, as a way of attempting to capture all the data for a module, said, I would like int.maxValue bytes starting at address 0. Just give me everything. And sure enough, the module then starts streaming data, but it streams data that some of it doesn't appear anywhere in the schema. So the tables that I was mentioning earlier on in the documentation, there's some bits that aren't mentioned there, and some things that I think I didn't get either. And I don't get the same data every time I try that, just dump everything. So it's a little bit flaky if you're doing weird things. But speaking of weird things, the oddest aspect is that MIDI is 7-bit. All your messages, every byte that you send, the top bit is clear. Now, the way that the address space within I tend to think of this as, this is a memory bank, and I'm just sort of setting bits in memory and fetching bits from memory. And it's done 7-bit as well. So you end up with addresses 0 to 7F, and then 1 byte later is 100. And this was one of the first lessons that I learned, that this is really quite painful to work with. So I ended up early on coming up with a module address struct that first, whenever you say, well, I want this address, it will check that it's valid, and you can add an offset to it. And this is where it reminds me very strongly of calendar arithmetic, which many things do, admittedly. But you get odd things where I've deliberately put it so that if you take address 7F and add 1 to it, you will get 100. But equally, if you take 7F and add 0x81, so 129 to it, you'll get the same address. So there's this weird thing of non-reversible arithmetic, and unfortunately that's had to bleed in a couple of places into the rest of the code. One of the things I have decided I did wrong was trying to stick to this 7-bit addressing. It's been really, really useful in some senses, because I've had to take all of those tables there and come up with an awful lot of JSON. So as an example, let's have a look. So the root container, I've modeled everything in terms of containers, and a container either contains more containers or fields. So the root container only contains other containers, which are current, setup, trigger, etc., or kit, and there are however many kits we have, which is specified somewhere else, copies of this container kit. So they start at 0x0300, and note that this is a JSON file, so all of these have to be in double quotes, because otherwise it wouldn't be valid JSON. So I've had to do a bunch of conversions and nastiness. And the gap between each kit is 20000. Now, this is great from an authoring perspective, because this is exactly what it says on the tin in the documentation. It's lousy for anything later on. And I think what I probably should have done is convert at the point where I convert all this JSON into a real immutable schema, and I'll come on to immutability later on. I should probably have, at that point, converted it into just regular, a flat address space. It's still going to have gaps in, but one that doesn't have this weirdness, where you sort of pick bits of memory that aren't contiguous. I've mentioned the Explorer a few times now, and I think it's probably time that you see it, because other things will make more sense. Now, unfortunately, this being my code and I'm rubbish at UIs and things, unless anyone knows a way that you can just change the default font for an entire WPF window in like one go, out of interest, how many people here are WPF reasonably experts? Yeah, there's one there. Is there an easy way of doing it on a window-wide basis? Yeah, I love experimenting in this sort of thing. So right, this is module loader. So on the window itself, I don't have any styles or templates or anything like that, because that's far too professional. If I've got... I need a style. Oh, well, hang on, I've got font size as a property here. Let's set it to something huge and see. I don't believe that this is just going to work. Surely not. Wow! OK, I'll need to do that for a few other files, but you'll be able to see the UI. So, right, let me give me 2 ticks to do that to the other files, and I'll pop that down a little bit, because I think 30 is a little bit overkill. Half of these I probably don't really need to do, but without knowing which half. Final one, I think. OK. Wow. Gotta love WPF. Obviously now there are still 3 pixel gaps between things, so I doubt that those will be bumped up. So the UI is, this is the module loader, again increasingly inaccurately named, and this is always present. When you close this, it closes the whole application. And this is mostly a log file, because I'm thoroughly expecting that if anyone in the world ever actually uses this apart from me, and I do have 2 other users, in fact, then things are likely to go wrong, and it's really useful if they can send me a log file. And that has already been useful, which is why save log file is one of the main things that you can do, so they don't have to take screenshots and stuff. But from here, you can see that the device options bar here is live, and that's because I have actually got the TD17 plugged in and ready to go. So it's detected it here. So far, this is just using MIDI stuff, and I'm using the Sanford MIDI library. And one of the things you can do, you detect the ports, and then you can send the Roland identification thing. So you send something out, and it comes back saying, yeah, I'm a TD17, and this is my family, and this is, family code 843. And so I have 2 known schemas, the TD17 and the TD50. So if you had a TD50, then it would, I believe it would genuinely say, I've detected you've got a TD50. And if you don't have either of those, any of that, then this bar is all disabled. So within this, I can do load all data. And this is currently for all 10,000 containers in the system, and that's just containers with fields. It's sending something out saying, please could I have kit 10, kit unit main 3 or whatever. It's actually saying, I would like all the data for 10 bytes starting at that address. And then it's receiving it. And I don't know whether we've got a pause. I think I've got a slight pause before I send the next request. I don't try to do anything in parallel. In theory, I should be able to sort of flood the device with requests and hope that they all come back. That feels like it's just asking for trouble, really. But this obviously takes a few minutes. It takes longer on the TD50 because it's more expensive and has more data. So you can just load a single kit. So kit number 30 is the bottle phaser. And that will load into Kit Explorer, which is just, so we'll see Module Explorer later on, but Kit Explorer and Module Explorer are the same thing. It's just Kit Explorer is scoped to a single kit. And this is where I can play some notes. So I will later on be playing audio separately. When I hit play note, this is going to send a MIDI signal down to the module, and the module is going to react as if I have hit tom 1, so the first tom drum. And then the audio is coming back via USB and then out through my headphone port to the speakers. So it would also be coming through the headphones on the TD17. And do you know what? I haven't. So this is one of the interesting bits. that is not what bottle phaser sounds like, because that's just sending, hey, play MIDI, play whatever note. Each of these instruments has a different MIDI note, and it's saying play note 35 or whatever tom 1 head is. But it doesn't say, by the way, you need to be playing kit number 30. So I've got to manually go and set to module 30. Sorry, kit 30. And now it will sound different. So there's all kinds of, these are all quite bizarre. And we will explore what makes this bizarre later on, because there's, so you can hear that here there's a bit of weird effects going on there, and we're going to bring them up to 11 later on. So loading a single kit was quick, but if you wanted the whole module, obviously you don't want to have to load it from the device every time, partly because you might not have the device plugged in. So I've now got my own file extensions of vkit. The audio I'll come back to. So vkit is a file containing a single kit, and vdrum is a complete module. So we can now look at everything, and this is not quite the physical layout of the containers, because, for example, the kit container does contain all this information. It's got all the stuff over here, common things, so volumes and panning and things, all the instruments, kit ambience, so this is where I said before you can make it sound as if it were in a concert hall, and the multi-effects is what made the bottle phaser sound weird, and I believe that that would be the phaser multi-effects type. Yeah, there's phaser A and phaser B and step phaser. Let's just cancel those changes. I will come back to changes later on. So after I'd worked out how to get all the data off the module, I then needed to work out how to display it. And I initially displayed it in sort of physical form. So under kit 1, you'd have 20 different, because there are 20 different pads here, 20 triggers. There would be the main information for trigger 1, the main information for trigger 2, etc., all in their own containers. Then others for sub-instruments. So each trigger has 2 instruments that are layered on top of each other. So this one, for example, is a beach kick drum with a deep shell kick drum sort of layered underneath it. And typically you can see that here the sub-instrument is a volume of minus 12.5 dB. Typically you would make the sub-instrument quieter than the main instrument. It's just to add a bit more oomph, a bit more feel to it. But those will all be separate, and the v-edit, everything was different on a per instrument basis, and it was really annoying. So I thought, well, I need a logical view as well as the sort of pure physical view. And in the end, I took out the ability to view it on the pure physical, basically, here's the layout in memory, because it was not terribly useful. Now this is, you may not believe this, but this UI is the result of quite a lot of work trying to make the UI look nice. You should have seen it when I started. In fact, when I started, I didn't have a UI at all. I did what I always do, which is to use a console application, because console applications are dead easy to make them just give you some information. So the first things I did was, okay, I will detect the MIDI devices and print out their numbers so that I can hard code, right, you want to have an input of number 1 and an output of number 2, because writing code to do the detection took time in itself. So, okay, console app, please dump out, using Sanford MIDI, what your possible devices are. Done. Next thing, what happens if I send a sysx message that's saying, please give me the information at address 0. And I think I probably did do address 0 because it's the easiest thing to do. And in particular, the container at address 0 is a single byte. It is what's the current kit. So it took a little while even to get that going, because the sysx client, the sysx messages have to have a Roland-specific checksum at the end of them, and I got various things wrong, and working out how all the 7-bitness worked took a little while. But I was really excited when I ran it once and it said 51, and then I changed to a different kit and it said current kit 20. It's like, yes, I can do this, right? And then what's the next thing you do? Can I do it the other way? Can I say, make the current kit 15 or whatever? And yes, that worked as well. And it's like, okay, now I know those primitives, I can see so many other possibilities. I will come at the end to some reflections, because this is, if you've been thinking, when's John going to get to the good bit? This is just a meandering talk. It's just me talking about what I've enjoyed doing. I'm hoping that you'll get useful information. No, not useful information. There will be no useful information unless you're trying to do this. But useful thoughts out of it in terms of, well, how do we do development? How do we have fun? How do we experiment? How do we learn? So I needed to have those primitives, and I needed to work out what would be feasible at a relatively low level. And then all of this was pretty much in my head. I imagined something a bit like this when I was standing in Dawson's looking at this and thinking, oh, that looks pretty posh, pretty smart stuff. I wonder what I can do with it. I had in mind something exactly like this. The first version of a UI was in Windows Forms. Now, I haven't quite worked out, partly I wanted to do Windows Forms and WPF using .NET Core 3. As it happens, this is now using .NET 4.7.2 because of NAudio not supporting a few bits that I need within .NET Core, but for a while it was all in .NET Core 3, yay. The Winforms designer didn't work at the time, for me anyway, whereas the WPF designer did. But I still went for Winforms to start with. I don't like the designer much anyway. I like to have good control and be able to see what controls I'm building. So I manually wrote a Winforms UI, which looked kind of similar to this. It had the log screen, the module loader, and then a tree view, and then group boxes. But for some reason, just switching between kits at least, certainly for if I load the TD50, so because one of my 2 users sent me, they saved their file, their module, so they went through the loading bit that takes forever, and then they saved the file and then sent it to me. So I think this is Mark rather than Luke, and this is his kit, and I hope he doesn't mind me showing you. This is, these are clearly the kits that he plays when he's gigging or whatever, and this is presumably their set list, is all these different songs. So, what's he got for I Will Survive? Here we have 3 different sets of multi-effects. I think each instrument you can say, well, I want it saturator or reverb or delay, but different things on a per instrument basis. So yeah, all kinds of other instruments. But this took forever to switch between kits. It would take about a second. I thought that's really, really slow. And I tried to improve things. But I thought, I wonder whether it'll be faster with WPF. Because in order to, when I switch between kits, I'm creating a group box for this, and then a grid within the group box, and then a label here, and a label over here, and another label. And it is creating hundreds of controls. And within Windows Forms, each of those controls is a new Win32 handle. And it doesn't really scale terribly well. I'm absolutely sure there are ways of making that better that I'm just not aware of. Heck, it took me a while to get the high DPI working within Windows Forms. But when I went to WPF, it just magically, out of the box, was just so much faster. It was wonderful. And you get the niceness of the designer. So when I don't really want to say the word design UIs because they more congeal. But I don't start dragging things around, but what I do is edit the XAML and look at what it looks like up there. And the benefit of XAML over handwriting the code is just amazing. what I haven't got, what I haven't worked out how to do is get rid of a load of code within Data Explorer. And I must remind me to talk about inheritance later on. There is a bunch of code. There's fundamentally a lot of code in here, 600 odd lines of code. Let me find format descriptions. There we go. So here it creates a label and then it sets the grid. And this sort of thing feels like I should be able to do it in XAML and use it as some sort of template and easily be able to add rows to a grid and all kinds of things that are just a bit painful to do plainly in code. I mean, the good thing is it's easy to read code, but it would be nicer if I could have some XAML in one place that I could tweak and change that. And I'm also absolutely sure that I need some templating or styling because I've got, if I look back at the XAML, each of my labels has margin equals 5, padding is 0, 2, or padding is 5, 2, depending on exactly where it is and whether it's a button or a label. So I've got this kind of thing repeated all over the place. And this is just me being a novice with XAML. I am frankly, and WPF in general, I'm frankly astonished that it looks as good as it is. That is a testament to how good WPF is that even I'm able to create a user interface with it. So I've shown you most of what you can do. The most recently added feature, actually no, I added 3 features on Sunday in a coffee shop. Because one of the things I've taken away from this is once you've got the basics of the architecture, adding extra UI features can be really easy. So on Saturday, I added this context menu. There was previously Open Copy in Kit Explorer was just a button up at the top. So it's a bit odd having all these buttons here, but everything's really easy to get at. So that literally does exactly what it says. So it creates a copy in memory of Kit1 in this case, and opens it in a new window. And then you can copy that to somewhere else on the module or save it as a Kit file, etc. But I had this ability to say copy to another Kit. So this is all in memory. I don't need to worry that I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to copy this to Kit number 5, and you'll see, so this type prog down here, when I hit copy, yay, that becomes the acoustic one. Likewise, I can import, so I've got Alice's bongo, import that, or export to a file instead. And those were really trivial features to add when you've got all the relevant information. Now, what took a bit longer was inspired by working with Alice somewhat antisocially. So our friends Chris and Sarah had invited me and Holly and Alice and Lola and all our kids over for lunch one day. And I said, right, well, Alice, I'll bring the laptop and we can design a Latin kit. Knowing that this would be a bit antisocial, but only for some of the time. But we found that we didn't really know what to do because we found that there are a load of, we were there saying, okay, well, we'll make it kit 51, fine, and I'll go into edit mode. So normally it's all read-only, and you have to say, I want to be in edit mode, and then you edit stuff. So .NET Oxford, let's put that as the subname, and then think, okay, well, what good instruments would we have? Well, they'll probably be in the percussion bit. So we went to the instrument selection bit, and I'll come back to this in a bit as well. Out of the preset instruments, because you can have user samples as well, I will have percussion. In fact, gosh, it's already on gong. Yeah, this is one that I've messed with already, I think. So within percussion, there are loads of different things. And what does a tablatin sound like? We had no idea. We weren't sitting at the drum kit, so there was no way of us finding out. So this felt like a recipe for another bit of coding. So I thought, what can I do here? It's not like you can just copy the samples off the kit. So if I hit play note here, as I did earlier on, it's still on bottle phaser, but that's fine. Then that's asking the module to play the note. But as I mentioned, we may not have the module plugged in. I'll leave it plugged in for the setup bit, which is if you know that you're going to want to do this offline, or it's just useful to do it, you can say, I want to record the instruments. And what this is going to do, I'll actually use it, I'll set it going because it'll be fun to listen to briefly, is it will play each of the 200 instruments. It's going to take a kit and say, okay, I'm going to take a local copy of the data for instrument 1, which is the kick, and then set the kick to be instrument 0, play it, and record the audio over the USB, just as if you were recording a microphone or something else, then silence the kit, stop recording, then set the instrument to be instrument 1, then instrument 2, etc. So if we, right, .NET, Oxford, if we hit start recording, and in fact, it's doing the wrong thing because I said use kit 100, but it was still using kit 30. So one of the next features is going to be to set the current kit to whatever I've selected and then set it back again at the end. But if I do this properly this time, and .NET Oxford again, oh, there we go, right. So now it should actually, that was a maple kick drum and then a birch kick drum. That sounds quite similar, doesn't it? Beech. Now it's recording each of them for 2.5 seconds. Most of these drums don't take 2.5 seconds to go down, but the cymbals actually keep going for 5, 6, 7 seconds. But I found that 2.5 seconds is long enough. And obviously, if you make it 10 seconds per instrument and you've got 311 instruments to record, that takes quite a long time. So I will stop this now because here's one I prepared earlier in true Blue Peter fashion. So that then saves a file, so this one, which is with those defaults, but also including the 7 user samples, is 75 megs. Okay, so I'm not distributing this file for 2 reasons. Firstly, it's huge. I wouldn't want to put it in the installer. And secondly, this feels like it's probably Roland copyright and they really, really, really don't want you distributing this. I mean, anyone else can, but I would recommend not. But this means that now, when I'm sitting with Alice, we can now, let's do it here. To prove nothing up my sleeves, as it were, we will unplug the USB, and now when I run this, it's going to say, oh, not detected any input or output MIDI ports, so that's all grayed out. So that's proving that it's not going to come through there, but we can say, right, output to the headphones, and now we'll go for my favorite 2 instruments, which I had no idea what these were before, but the Cuica drums are friction-based drums from Brazil, I want to say, but I'm probably wrong. And just listen to these, they're brilliant. Sorry, need to. Isn't that just amazing? Can you imagine bashing away and it's going? So that feature took quite a lot of effort because suddenly I was having to use N-Audio because I was recording stuff and playing stuff back and having a whole new file format. One of the things I rapidly learnt was I don't want to be messing with writing file format code all the time. So you've seen a bit of the schema that I had that's all a load of JSON and huge amounts of JSON. So I've taken a long time coding. Copying out all of this information from the sheets took rather a long time as well. So this one file is 700 lines. There are, under the multi-effects, there are all the different kinds of effects you can have, and each of those is sort of 100 or so lines. That was a lot of effort. You might say I've got too much spare time. But then I thought, well, if I'm going to do a file format, I know how to do file formats because I know about protocol buffers. You really don't want to write all this information out as a JSON file or something with one line of JSON for volume 0, instrument 1, etc. Don't know what just fell over, but we'll keep going. However, protocol buffers make all of this simple. So this is the file format. It does actually have a magic number to start with, something like vdrum.jls or something. And then any file is going to be one of the drum files, so I can tell which thing it is. If it's a .vdrum, it's going to have a module, or it could have a kit, or it could have module audio. And these have just got, it's a schema. But when I added the audio part, so a module audio that contains, it knows what schema it's for, whether it's TD17 or TD50, or eventually whatever Roland comes out with next. It knows a bit about the audio format. It knows how long you've captured per instrument, and then it's got the actual data. This bit of it, the file format bit, took about a quarter of an hour to say, okay, well, I've got the data, now I would like to write it to disk and be able to read it back from disk. That was trivial because of this. So just for one aspect, I was not reinventing the world. One of the other things that I did wonder several times is there's not very much that's special about this code, this application. It's saying, well, here's a schema, here's some data, please let me see it and edit it. I'll show you one of the slightly difficult bits, and my guess is that even with the slightly difficult bit, there are probably existing bits of software that you can say, here's a schema in their own format, and it will show you a user interface, and you tell it how to get at the data. I'm not aware of any specific examples of that. I'm sure they do exist, and I reckoned that if I did the research to find them, I would have no idea what to search for particularly. This is kind of line of business things. I'm sure it exists somewhere, but I would probably find so much time researching it that I might as well write it, and that'll be much more fun, and it's probably going to be commercial anyway. So if you do know of something like that, do let me know. But other than that, I want to show you the slight tricky bits, which are around what are called overlays. So each instrument has, you say which instrument it is, and then what its V-edit is. So this is a kick proc elec, and it's got a pitch and delay. If we say I want a snare drum, it's got tuning, muffling of tape or donut, and strainer adjust of loose, medium, or tight. If it's a cymbal, so a crash cymbal, it starts with a size of 16, and this is because it's a 16-inch dark crash. If we do 18-inch, then the size defaults to 18. So these are different fields, and they're overlaid in memory. So every crash cymbal has size and muffling. Every kick has whatever it had before, tuning and, where's the kick? Kick has tuning, muffling, and snare buzz, etc. So I needed ways of representing this, and when you change preset, if I left the data as it was, so tuning of 61, what does that data in memory mean if I just left it there but changed to a crash cymbal? Does that mean it's a 61-inch crash cymbal? Like, even by my standards of extremes, that would be pretty strange. So I had to work out ways of changing the user interface to react when one bit changed and affect memory. And it gets a bit more complicated with the crashes, as I showed, because for the most part, I just need to change the user interface when I change instrument group. These are all different instrument groups. But then when I change actual instrument, I also need to change the size. So because otherwise, the 18-inch crash, if you make it 16-inch, that sounds very much like the 16-inch crash. It's in some ways Roland sort of cheating and saying, look how many instruments we have. They're all just the same with different sizes. I suspect there are still some differences. And the same was true slightly differently. That was particularly awkward because, as you can actually see here, main instrument is in one container, one bit of memory, and I had to say, well, when that bit of memory changes, you need to affect this bit of memory over here. What was slightly easier but more annoying in terms of doing the schema was the multi-effects. So at this point, let's bring up the phaser again, just because I want to show how silly this gets. Right, if I go on to bottle phaser, and what I'll do is I'll copy bottle to kit 51. Right, and because it makes it slightly easier, we'll open it in Kit Explorer, because I can then very easily copy just the whole kit to the device. In fact, I'll copy it to 52. I'll save it as 52 because 51 I've got as my Latin. Right, so currently, let's see what the multi-effects are like. Let's copy it so that I can then have it on. Yeah. So if let's find something that sounds suitably silly. I think the crashes will be best, or the ride. Yes, let's stick with the ride. So that's currently got the multi-effects of phaser, and it's on. Level is nearly to the top already, but we can stick it higher. And I have no idea what these phases are and things. Let's change things a bit, copy that to the device, and play it again. And this should now be even weirder. Oh, I need to select the ride again. It's definitely different. I'm not entirely sure I know in what way it's different. Set the resonance down. Let's just sort of shove everything up to the top. Yeah. Oh, the tempo sync is, that's broken. When I click tempo sync, it should change from the rate hertz to something saying, do you want it to be crotchet or quaver, etc. And that doesn't seem to be doing it. So that's, if someone could send me an email saying get tempo sync to work, that would be good. And I absolutely mean that. Any of you who has my email address, just send me an email now. Sorry? Yeah. Right, so let's, having shoved everything to maximum. Yeah, that's worked, hasn't it? So if you thought it sounded a bit weird before, that was before we turned everything up to 11, as it were. Right, it strikes me it's 8 o'clock. I was fearing that I might run out of things to say. That's clearly not happened yet, but it's probably time to take a break. So we'll reconvene in, do we normally have 10, 15 minutes? We'll have a look at some of the code, not the details of the code. It's more around the organization that's interesting here. And I'll start by collapsing everything. So you've seen, I probably won't need to run it again. You've seen what it looks like. I would just point out there are 6 different projects here. So console is just so that I still, every so often, fiddle. What was the last thing I did? I checked that I could play notes, and I played 3 different notes. I like to have a sort of sandbox, usually as a console app. Importantly, I've got a data, which is the sort of business model aspect of it. This is where all the schema lives. This is where module address and all the 7-bit addressing bits go. This does not know anything about MIDI. I have separately a vdrumexplorer.midi that doesn't know anything about data. This has pros and cons. So they're each responsible for very little, but it means that I can't immediately populate the module data, which is in .data, via the MIDI. I have to sort of get a byte array. I would like to have a module segment, which I've got as a separate, a data segment. I've got as a different type. It would be nice if my MIDI client could return a data segment, but in order to do that, I would have to make MIDI depend on data. And at the moment, Yeah, should MIDI depend on data? Should data depend on MIDI? Who knows? It's all a bit tricky. Keeping them entirely separate at least makes that slightly easier. And then the WPF depends on both data and MIDI. But this separation of concerns, having separate applications, separate projects, was what's really saved me when I went from Windows Forms to WPF. Okay, I only had two dialogues. I had the module loader with the log file, etc., and I had the tree explorer, the tree view. But literally converting from Winforms to WPF took, I think, about an hour and a half, and I was watching TV at the same time. Because so much of it was done in the data layer. And the fact that I was going from Winforms to WPF made it easier because the XAML was just easier to do. While this is project level single responsibility principle, it's really saved my hide several times. I mentioned inheritance. I've shown the Kit Explorer and the Module Explorer, and they look very, I will actually bring up the app so that you can compare and contrast. So if I bring up a kit and I bring up a module, so you can see they've both got tree views and they've both got, within a kit, it looks exactly the same because these are both for the TD17. For the TD50, it has a slightly different layout, but that's fine. That's all schema-based. There is no code that knows the difference between a TD17 and a TD50. That's entirely schema-based, which was another big win, other than, well, there are times where it's taken so much effort to express in a schema something that could be done in 2 lines of code that I have to wonder whether that was worth it. And for just 2 kits, maybe it wouldn't be. If Roland come out with a load more kits that are compatible with this, and I've seen that there are keyboards that sort of use the same kind of protocol, so it would be a very, very different schema, but kind of similar ideas. At the moment, all schema-based. But you can see the Module Explorer and the Kit Explorer look very similar, other than, well, we have copy data to device, copy kit to device, and an extra bit of information there. And, well, they've both got the play note part. So these are actually looking very, very similar now. Oh, and there's default kit number. So I played with a few different ways of doing this, and I've ended up doing both of these inherit from Data Explorer. And I'm hoping someone afterwards can tell me the right way of doing this within WPF. But I've got Data Explorer that has YAML and has all the optional controls. So it's got the default kit number and the kit to copy to and things. And within Module Explorer, within the constructor, each of them has a parameterless constructor so that, well, this doesn't even have a parameterless constructor because I never see the designer for Module Explorer or the designer for Kit Explorer. There's just the designer for Data Explorer. But Data Explorer has a parameterless constructor that, when I find the code, that just calls initialize component and can't do anything else. Anything else you do is going to cause a null pointer exception, null reference exception. But there's an alternative constructor that the others chain to that says, well, here's the logger, here's the schema, here's the data, and what's your root node within that data, within that schema. And a few other little bits. When you want to save a file, what should your save file filter look like? If that's a bizarre thing to have in a constructor, but it doesn't change over the lifetime of the object, likewise the Explorer name. And then I've got some relatively obscure virtual methods, so save to stream. So save whatever data you've got to a stream, copy it to a device, and a few other virtual methods. And this, after trying to use composition, this felt like actually it was the easiest thing, easiest way of getting at all of the controls, because like within Kit Explorer, we still need to be able to get at the default kit number text box. So I'm generally in favor of, and similar controls, I'm generally in favor of composition over inheritance. These are two very similar things, And in terms of code reuse, inheritance seems to be working for me at the moment. I've added quite a few new features since having this split, and it seems to be working. The way I got to this is possibly more interesting than the result, which is I took Module Explorer was the complete code. I copied it, deleted all the stuff that I didn't want within Kit Explorer, added some more stuff, and then when in doubt, start with things that are different, right? How much of this code is still actually in common? Gosh, there's an awful lot of it. Okay, so it probably is worth pushing that up and trying to do code reuse. So it was effectively copy, modify, diff, and then using that diff, I could see which bit needed to only be in Kit Explorer, which bits only needed to be in Module Explorer, and which bits could be in Data Explorer. And when I say diff, I literally fired up kdiff3, and I'd very deliberately kept the methods in the same order. So it was, oh, it turns out I've deleted this method. It was a practical way of doing things. That was a sort of half-hour or so exercise to have those two different UIs. I wanted to make a point around performance and readability. So normally, I'm very much in favor of the readability side of things over everything else. But it was taking nearly 10 seconds to load the TD50 schema, and I'll explain why. So the TD50 has 100 kits. Each kit has 3 multi-FX things. The multi-FX is the reverb and phaser, etc., that I showed you before. And there are a lot of different options. Each of these has 10 or so different fields. So if you think of a field as, well, it's the bit down field that's at this position in memory, and you've got 3 of those for each kit, and all of this, I ended up having, I think it was 800,000 fields when I was parsing the schema. This took hundreds of megs of memory, and it took a very, very long time. So instead, I ended up with the idea of, well, I can use the same field for bit down by saying, well, when I want to use this field, you need to provide me not just the data as a sort of memory thing, but what's your context? What container are you part of at the moment? And where is that within memory? So I can then take the offset, add that to where the container is in memory, and then fetch the value from the data. That took 2-3 attempts and was really, really difficult. So the previous code was reasonably simple, massively inefficient, and relatively hard to refactor to what I've got now. I'm not convinced that what I've got now is right, is the best way of doing things. It's definitely better than it was before, and as a byproduct of making this much, much simpler, it now only loads a few thousand instances of fields, because those are all the distinct ones. There have been other benefits. It's now much easier to relocate a kit, because I can just say, well, okay, from the context of kit 51, do some stuff, copy things over. I would have struggled to justify doing that work in a professional setting. And obviously, if the performance had been just terrible, violating our performance requirements, then I could probably have justified it that way. It was so much easier because I was experimenting for fun. And this doesn't mean that I could now do it dead easily the next time. But if I face a similar situation at work, I will be able to, I think I could recognize that scenario again and at least put the effort in before the first implementation to doing whatever I would do. While I'm talking about fields, I want to mention the immutability aspect. So you've seen the schema as JSON. The whole do one thing, single responsibility principle, sort of goes into this as well. When I load the schema, I've got a bunch of things that are just in JSON. So I've got container JSON, dynamic overlay JSON, module JSON, etc. And these represent exactly what I've got in the JSON files. And I use Newtonsoft So JSON.NET to parse into a module JSON, to parse into field JSON. There's a little bit of trickery in there because I assemble from all of these JSON fields, JSON files, I assemble one giant JSON document. So where I've got things like $resource root.json, I've got some code that loads this file as JSON, then looks for every string field, and if it turns out that it starts with $resource : it says, OK, I will replace that string value with the JObject representation by loading root.json. Because originally I started having the whole schema in one file, and it was just, no, that's just not going to work. However, these JSON, by their very nature, JSON objects are mutable, because otherwise you can do immutability things within JSON.NET, but it's painful. Much easier to have everything mutable, which means obviously I'm using C#8, so everything's nullable because it's going to start off as null. But I don't want to see this, and you can see this is internal. I don't want to see this when I'm using it from the GUI. I don't want to mutate the schema. It would be meaningless to try to mutate the schema within the GUI. So I've got entirely separate things here, container, etc., all of which are immutable and deeply immutable. So I have some read-only dictionaries that I keep hidden and don't mutate. This caused a difficulty. It's caused some ugly code basically because C# isn't built for immutability. If you think about it, it makes sense that a schema knows the fields within it, or the containers within it that have the fields, etc. So parents know about their children. But equally, it sort of makes sense for a field to know the schema that it's in. And there are times where that's really important, in particular, so the instrument field. How is an instrument field going to know the maximum value that it can receive? Or how to format itself? Instrument 1, I need to know which instrument group it's in and what its name is, etc. So for that, I need to get all the information, but then I need to find the schema. So if you've got the schema knows the fields and the fields knows the schema, which do you build first? And you've got to build everything all in one go. No object is complete until the whole of the module schema is done. Which leads to some really ugly code, in particular within module schema. I don't like the fact that this constructor is nearly 40 lines long. Okay, that's really not nice. And that's having got as many of these things as possible, stuff that doesn't need to be recursively sort of cyclic. I've got a reasonable pattern of each of the JSON things where it can. So like instrument group, if I can find instrument group JSON, has to instrument group. So the mutable type knows how to mutate, how to convert itself into the immutable one. I've chosen it that way round. It feels cleaner for the immutable, the pure model, not to know about the JSON that it's come from. And if I end up with a different way of representing the schema, I could have a proto-representation, and that would have a to-instrument group, and the model itself can stay nice and pure. So I just wanted to mention that as something that was tricky. It was definitely the right thing to do. What I could have done is cheat and have all the fields have a schema property that's internally mutable. Build everything, give the schema the fields, and then iterate over all the fields and set the schema. And then you think, well, that's fine so long as in other bits of initialization, I never need to access the schema. When you don't have the invariant, even if it's publicly immutable later on, you lose a huge amount of the benefit. Right. I'm just trying to think of all the code things that I have noticed while I've been building this. There's one really interesting other thing that I've noticed, which is these are all the tests I've got. So 4 test classes. It turns out that I don't really like writing unit tests nearly as much as I'm pretty diligent at work. I write unit tests. I'm good on the testing front. For this, I've written a few tests in a few places. I wrote quite a lot for the JSON loader, and with all kinds of different examples. And that was all good and useful. For the most part, I don't think I've missed out by not writing tests. Most of the failures that I had, I probably wouldn't have thought to write the tests for them. This is in no way suggesting that tests are bad or that we shouldn't write tests. And I may go back, possibly after the next level of refactoring, I may go back and write some tests. The immutability thing makes it even harder to write tests because in order to create, if I want to test an instrument field, well, in order to construct that, I've got to know the module schema that it's part of. So I've got to have a test module schema that itself can't be built without the instrument group. And how am I going to do all of this? I probably need test schemas as JSON files that I then load, and that's going to be awkward. So if I do refactor, I will be refactoring around one aspect will be, can I do testability this way? I was having a chat over the break with someone who was telling me about WPF things, and we noted that I'm not using any data binding at the moment. And that's partly I don't have a view model. I'm not quite sure what I would do to create a view model because as I mentioned before, I've kept this all schema-based. So how can I could have a sort of dynamic view model, but then that might be tricky to bind to as well. I'm not sure. The view model would have to, there are a couple of ways it could go. Either the view model could know how to access data from module data. So module data is the thing that I've got here that is basically get me this bit of memory, set this bit of memory, still within the memory on the laptop. This is separate from sending it down to the module itself. But it's sort of, here's where all the real data is. Get me it 1 byte at a time. So either I could have a view model that constantly accesses this and sets stuff in it. I was thinking what I might do instead of that is have view models and maybe even models that are that aren't related to the data at all, but you say, right, please now container serialize everything down to the module data or populate the model from that module data as if I were loading a file or saving a file. And then they're just normal POCOs, normal objects, and I can deal with them that way and not have to worry about the module data side of things at all. So that's one of the ways that I will do things in future, or I will look at in future. And I still don't know yet whether the right thing to do to be sort of schema-based. It's not like being schema-based made things trivial. I still had to transcribe all that JSON from the documentation. It would have been kind of just as easy if I'd done public class multi-FX and then had fields within that and public class reverb, fields within that, and I'd have had attributes to say where it belongs within the module data, etc. Is there very much difference between JSON and code? Some things would have been much, much easier in code. I wouldn't have had the JSON classes as extra code. So one option is I just start again and transcribe again from the tables or transcribe from the schema and just write the classes by hand. Or I could write a code generator to generate the view models and the models from the schema JSON. My experience with code generators is you really, really need to know what code you're going to generate first. So what I might end up doing is the first few models and view models by hand, and then write a code generator if it looks like it's going to be painful. I've learned an awful lot doing this. So I've said some of the lessons. I've also learned about Windows installers. There is actually a Windows installer. I think I've probably got a copy of 1.0.0 Alpha 2 demo code. All of this is on GitHub, by the way. github.com/jskeet/demo code, and then it's under the drums directory. But yeah, if I look, it's an MSI and everything, and it does stuff. I've already got it installed. This took 4 hours probably one afternoon, mostly through, there was a long, it's sort of an hour and a half YouTube video by Angel6 that takes you all the way through building a Wix installer. That didn't quite tell me everything I needed to know, but between that and the GitHub repository that went alongside it, and then some extra research, it basically did everything I needed to for the moment, with a few little quirks like I ship a sample TD17 module file, not the sound effects, but the module itself, so that any of you without any hardware at all can still play with it a bit. You won't be able to play any sounds, but you can sort of see what, you can investigate the UI and things, and send me patch requests to make it look nice. And that currently gets installed in program files, which isn't very nice, but I haven't worked out. Maybe it should be in program data, but maybe I should be creating a VDrum Explorer thing in the roaming data, but then how do I work out whether or not to uninstall it? And that probably involves learning more about Windows Installer than I really want to. The other thing I had to do was code signing. How many of you have done code signing? And I don't mean SNK files and strong naming, because that's dead easy. How many of you have done actual code authentic code signing? Like 3 of us, 4. It's expensive and really painful. So I had to pay 250 quid or something to, I think it was Komodo or something, and then find, I provided some information, and if I'd been a company, it would have been a bit easier, but then I had to find a notary and take along my passport and driving license and pay him 80 quid, and then he sent things, and unfortunately the validation company wasn't very good, and it was all really painful. This has been a very expensive hobby. I'm hoping that having a code signing certificate will be potentially useful for other things, so long as I use it within the next 3 years. That's how long it lasts. But it was really useful. I've known that code signing is a thing, and it's useful to go through the process just as an extra thing that I now know how to do, at least to the shallowest of levels. And it raises interesting questions, like I put down Jonathan Skeet as the owner of the certificate because that's my legal name, that's what's on my passport or whatever. I don't know, I suspect everyone in this room may be not confused by me being Jonathan Skeet rather than John Skeet, but if you're from a different culture where actually John and Jonathan aren't common names at all because it's not a Western culture, then you may not know that John is often used as a shortening for Jonathan. Are they going to trust that the file is actually from me? Who knows? But it's been interesting learning about all of those things. So to sort of wrap up a bit, I will stand up because I'm very aware of people at the back who've been sort of straining a bit. I apologize for it being awkward. I've really, really enjoyed doing this. It's hard to know what my drumming would be like if I hadn't written the code, because it's not quite as obvious as it sounds. I would have had a lot more free time, but I'd have had less motivation. For one thing, I'd probably have bought the TD1 DMK, and it wouldn't have sounded nearly as nice. So even when I'm bashing about badly, they're nice. It's a nice drum kit. It sounds pretty good. So it's kept me really interested in the drums. It's been great for my personal skills. Being able to experiment with this sort of thing. I've got other open source projects. I mean, my whole work is open source projects. But for Node-a-Time, I know that people use Node-a-Time professionally. I can do experiments in different branches and whatever, but I can't really ship it that way. This has been something that no one's going to care if I break it. They would care if I broke their module, but I think it's unlikely that I can actually spit down MIDI that would brick the module. And I think if I could find a way of doing that accidentally, then Roland really has a problem rather than me. Being able to have that freedom to experiment has been really liberating in terms of what I can do. I'll just change from Winforms to WPF. Currently, I'm going through a lot of pain to work out, I want to drop .NET 4.5 from the libraries that I produce for Google Cloud. Okay, and I will support .NET 4.6.1. And I have some data about how many customers we have on different versions and things, but it's not terribly clear. And so I'm having to go to great lengths to say, well, if I need to support .NET 4.5 later on, how am I going to do it? And it's to do with iasync enumerable and things in C#8 that make it really difficult. But I put together a, frankly, Byzantine plan this morning to say, well, if we absolutely have to, then you get to do this, which is not great for the .NET 4.5 users, but they've got something that works, and it doesn't impact anyone else too much. And that's probably the balance that I'll have. But that's been a huge amount of work for really very little benefit. Here I was able to say, oh, NAudio doesn't support .NET Core in terms of finding out device capabilities. Okay, I'll just ship Net 472. Fine, done. I didn't need to think about it any more than that. So it's really liberating like that. And that freedom allowed me to learn more. So I'm encouraging all of you to take whatever projects you're doing, whatever you're doing for fun in any aspect of your life, and maybe it's not a matter of writing code for it, but what other aspects of your life can you interweave within them, and you can get mutual benefits. If at all possible, it would be great if that can be good for the world too. I had originally expected, and I don't think the download count is exactly huge for this, but one of my test users who I know has a TD50, this could actually be of real benefit to them. They're visually impaired, and that UI just isn't going to cut it. Whereas they've got screen readers, so they could use, however awful this is as a UI in various ways, a screen reader can read it. Now, as it happens, the screen reader that they prefer to use is commercial, and I'd have to pay £250 for 3 months of usage to, even I draw the line somewhere. There is a free version that's not as good, apparently, and I need to invest some time in that and then learn about accessibility. Great, another thing to learn about. But this could end up having one user who it actually makes a difference to. So if you can find something that you can do and learn and have fun and do something good for the world at the same time, I would strongly encourage you to do it. And then, if it was a coding thing, come and tell .NET Oxford about it. Come tell other conferences about it. You've heard, you can't do any worse at it than I have tonight. I've just really just waffled. You've been extremely patient because I have just meandered my way through what I've enjoyed doing with the Drum Explorer. But this has been, I started doing this in July, and this has been some of the happiest times I've had recently, has been just the sheer joy of, I will build something from nothing, learning as I go. I have no idea about MIDI, very little idea about audio stuff. I've done some WPF before and kind of liked it, but what can I do? What can you build, basically? Thank you very much.